Welcome to the Drake Group's webinar series on critical issues in collegiate athletics. Today's discussion, are institutions being held accountable for delivering on the promise of a meaningful education? Our moderator is Bruce Smith, President and CEO, Academic Consulting and Empowerment Strategies.
And on behalf of the Drake Group Education Fund, thanks to all of you for joining us. The mission of the Drake Group Education Fund is to ensure that the promise of college athletics is realized for all stakeholders. We do that by generating fact-based research and recommendations that enable policymakers to make college sport a better place by ensuring that there is academic and ethical integrity in the conduct of college athletic programs. The focus of today's webinar is whether college athletes are truly being provided with the education they were promised and how that education is being measured. This conversation is an important preface to the April 18 SAC Symposium topic of D1 revenue sports graduation rates. We're honored to have a stellar group of panelists. I know you all had a chance to read their full bios when you registered for this program, but when we get started, I'll ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves before they respond to a first set of questions. Also, I want to emphasize that the panelists are expressing their own opinions and not the opinions of the organizations in which they are employed or our members, unless they make that distinction in their remarks. So let's begin with this. Part of the American narrative about colleges is that a college degree is the great equalizer. Not just a degree, but any time in college, we believe, will help people move up the socioeconomic ladder. On the one hand, data demonstrates a level of truth in that narrative. The data is clear. Any bit of time spent in college increases earnings potential. Spend multiple years in college and one's earning potential increases substantially. Complete a 4-year degree and that potential increases even more. On the other hand though, specifically for college athletes, many from low income backgrounds, the narrative can be at least a little bit more complicated. When they are recruited, college athletes are generally promised everything under the sun. In the NIL era, that even includes income, not directly from the institution, and let's be clear about that. Among the many things that recruits are promised is access to a meaningful education. In today's webinar, we'll interrogate the promise of a meaningful education, how athletic departments and academic departments are both complicit in failing to deliver on that promise of a meaningful education, and how that failure can impact college athletes. On recruiting trips, athletes and their families tour at university facilities, including academic buildings and athletic facilities. They are introduced to high-ranking faculty and administrators, academic support professionals, career services staff, and alumni with influence on and beyond the campus. Institutional representatives talk with them about building a personal brand, leveraging their athletic skill, and making the most of their time on a college campus. They hear messages about job placement success and starting salaries for recent graduates in specific fields. My experience tells me that those academic fields of study most often include, for those athletes, business, communication, psychology, fee law, and sometimes education. With what is often an unclear understanding of college majors and academic fields of study, these are the fields of study that many 18-year-olds and their families believe hold the most promise. Along with the promises that comes along with the college recruitment process, there is the promise of a meaningful education, a meaningful college education, along with meaningful experiences. Listening to folks like Notre Dame AD Jack Swarbrick from his piece in the New York Times recently, college athletes trade their athletic skills and labor for access to that promise of a meaningful college education. As we discussed at the top, and as Swarbrick implies, the meaningful college education that scholarship college athletes get in exchange for their labor and skill has value, and it should have value. We're gathered here today to get to this thing called the promise of a meaningful education. My experience as an academic support professional for college athletes and now an advocate for athletes and consultant for coaches in schools tells me that it's very difficult for college athletes, especially those competing at the highest levels, to access anything that resembles a meaningful college education. Our panelists today will help us uncover the meanings of the academic success data shared by the NCAA and others, analyze how meaningful the educational experience for most college athletes actually is, and dig into the kinds of academic support that athletes have access to. So I'll pass the mic to our panelists, and we'll hear from Lisa Rubin, Richard Southall, Howard Kroon III, and David Ridpath in that order. Lisa, take us away.
Thank you, Bruce, and thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Lisa Rubin. I'm an associate professor in the College of Education at Kansas State University, and I conduct research specifically on college athlete support services, both the professionals who serve them and the types of athlete development programming and support that college athletes receive, as well as their performance academically. So I also research generally academic advising for college students and how college or campus advisors and faculty advisors collaborate and communicate with athletic advisors. So I'm really honored to be part of this esteemed panel. One of the questions I wanted to address first is, to what extent do college athletes have control over the choice of their academic major? And I know Howard also might weigh on this as well later. I think there's like Bruce said, athletes are offered everything under the sun during recruiting. And I know as an advisor myself, I've worked with transfer students who have come in, the coach promised they could major in whatever they wanted, but didn't even tell them, oh, your transfer credits may not work in the majors you actually want to do. And I've seen that tear apart students' hopes and dreams for the future just from that one moment that I had to deliver that bad news. So I think it's really important that students understand, whether they're incoming freshmen or transfers, which is a lot more common now with the transfer portal, that they have realistic choices. If they're freshmen, they should have access to everything offered at that institution in terms of major. And I think any athletic advisor or support professional in athletics has the best interests of students in mind. It's the environment of athletics that puts the pressure on advisors to potentially funnel students into specific areas of study. And that is not necessarily how, like, the N4A, the National Association of Academic and Student Athlete Development Professionals, has a code of ethics. It is important that athletes have the choice of major that they wish to pursue. It's the challenge of conflicting classes and practice times, and anything that academically will take away from the athletic commitment a student has is going to be a problem. And then the student must find a plan B, C, D, or E, after that conflict occurs. And it does happen, unfortunately, quite a bit, especially if practice times change semester to semester, or in a year-round sport, as I consider basketball, because it spans 2 semesters. It really makes it difficult for students to have consistency across their enrollment. So I think personally that athletic advisors tend to have the best interest of athletes in mind and want them to pursue the degree of their choice. But unfortunately, the system itself does not allow that to happen in all cases. And thank you very much.
My name is Richard Southall, and I'm a professor in the Department of Sport and Entertainment Management at the University of South Carolina. And I'm also director of the College Sport Research Institute. CSRI serves as a research consortium. We sponsor an annual academic conference on college sport. We also publish a journal called the Journal of Issues in Intercollegiate Athletics. And we annually release graduation rate analyses using the adjusted graduation gap reports to disseminate information on college athlete graduation rates. The question that I was given to discuss is, when we say meaningful education, what does that include? Is it something more than graduation? Is it access to opportunity? Well, I think that question goes to the heart of the matter of the NCAA's collegiate model of athletics, and whether it is in fact an educational model or a commercial model. The research that I conduct individually and with colleagues, we look at the collegiate model institutional field, looking at what is being emphasized, whether it's athletic and labor production or whether it's educational opportunities. I look forward to, during this webinar, to discussing that issue of equal opportunity and educational access. I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. All righty. I will jump in. Hello, everybody. Howard Kroom. I am an associate athletic director at Oregon State University. I'm the athletic department's chief diversity officer and director of student services. Prior to coming to OSU this past July, I spent about 12 years in student athlete academic services across a number of institutions, mostly in Southern California. And I got my doctorate at USC in educational leadership. And my focus of my research is on the commodification of Black football student athletes and looking at career behavior and post-college preparation for student athletes while they are in school. The question that I'm going to be addressing just briefly, and I know we'll circle back to it, is how extensive is the tendency of some institutions to focus on eligibility maintenance over access to a real education? So we're talking about prioritizing NCAA academic eligibility over a meaningful education. And I think Dr. Rubin hit on it well when she talked about there's a pressure that exists. You know, there's a pressure from particularly when we look at the practitioners in student athlete academic services, the academic counselors and academic advisors, and there's a pressure to answer to their boss, to answer to the coach, who has pressure to answer to the athletic director, who has pressure to answer to the president. And so what I want to say about the tendency to focus on eligibility is the system, everyone is incentivized to do that. All of the actors are incentivized to focus on eligibility. And what I mean by that is that's what's being tracked. That's what's being measured. How do we measure and how do we hold folks accountable for a real education, a meaningful education, which we're going to define, what Dr. Southall said, we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but how do we hold people accountable? What incentive structures exist to push folks towards a quote unquote real education? And right now, it's not really, you can't really track it, or it's not really tracked. What is tracked is who's eligible and who's not, who's able to play on Saturday and who's not. Those things, those are tracked. Where are we at with our APR and our GSR? These measures at the NCAA that we have to be accountable for. If we don't hit certain numbers, we either don't get our incentives, we don't get our bonuses, or even worse, we face sanctions and we can't go to a bowl game, we can't go to the NCAA tournament. If that happens, that hits our bottom line. So from the top all the way down to the practitioner that touches the student athlete day to day, there's a pressure that exists and there's an incentive that exists to focus on NCAA academic eligibility. That creates a culture of norms, and that's how folks operate. So how pervasive is it, or how common is it to focus on eligibility? Is very common. And as a matter of fact, the folks who really want to focus on a meaningful education, they're fighting against the system and the culture that is set up to incentivize the opposite. So it's a pretty tough thing to navigate for all parties involved, especially the good people who really want to ensure that athletes have a quality experience while they're in college. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be on this panel with many good friends and people I go back a long time with. I'm Dr. Dave Ridpath. I'm a professor of sports business at Ohio University in the College of Business and Department of Sports Management. I've been involved in college athletic reform for, it's hard to believe, a couple of decades after a pretty long career in intercollegiate athletics. And I always just put it briefly as that I was probably the most jaded supporter of the system. I believed that it was an educational model and not a commercial model. I believed it was about education first. And on paper, it looks really good that someone can play a sport. And while they're playing that sport in our American system where college can be very expensive, that you can get a significant amount of financial aid to be able to, as Jack Schwarbrick said, that Bruce mentioned, that you get this great, as often called, world-class education in exchange for playing a sport. It sounds very good on paper, but I think as Howard, somebody who's working in the system right now, stated, the pressures are a much different story. And it was difficult for me to see, as somebody who supported the system, to see what was really going on and actually saying college athletes who could not read, who could not write at the college level, read at the college level, to be able to see that and actually see them being shepherded through as more of an asset, a financial asset, as a football, basketball player, whatever it may be, rather than an individual. And I found myself, thankfully, caring about the individual. I wanted them to get what was promised. And when I saw that wasn't happening, I started pushing back against the system. And that's one of the reasons I'm not working in the system anymore, is that I pushed back on it. And I told myself that maybe I would be naive, maybe I'm like Don Quixote, but I'm going to do whatever I can to try to change it. Because if it is about education, then it needs to be about education. If it is about playing a professional sport, being attached to a school, then let's just tell the truth about it and then come up with another model and other ways to access education. And I think there's many ways that we can go. And listening to the congressional hearing yesterday, listening to Jack Swarbrick on a podcast and reading his op-ed, there's a lot of people out there that their incentive is very clear. They still want to make a lot of money. They still want to protect the money, and they still want to control the athlete. And if we're talking about true social mobility is education. And we are not delivering on the promise. And yes, this even trickles down to Division II and Division III. We are not delivering on the promise of educational access, of prime educational access to our athletes. And we have to reconcile that. We cannot continue to mask it with an APR that doesn't measure anything, or a graduation success rate that is a very flawed measurement. And I know Dr. Southall is going to get into that later. We need to call this what it is. We either need to do it right or we need to change. And that's what I hope we can talk about today. But I will tell you that the current academic measurements, and hearing people yesterday in front of Congress saying that we're doing this great service by providing access to a wonderful educational opportunity, is largely false. And that needs to be brought to the forefront, and we need to do what we can to either fix it or do something else. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, panelists, for those introductions and for helping us figure out where we're going to be headed this afternoon. Richard, you talked about a couple things that I want to get into. And one, David just alluded to, these academic measures that the NCAA uses, APR and GSR. I think at least a couple of us on this panel, maybe all of us on this panel, see them as, to use the term, shams. Can you talk a little bit about how APR and GSR is used, what the data that tells us, and how, and for all the other panelists as well, how we might better measure whether or not athletes are having access to a meaningful education?
Well, thank you for everybody being on this panel, and thanks for the introduction to talking about graduation rates. First of all, let me let folks know each of the graduation rate metrics that are utilized have some flaws and some difficulties with them. That's any statistical analysis is going to have limitations. But what you have to understand is there's a difference between the federal graduation rate, or FGR, graduation success rate, and the metric that Dr. Woody Eckert developed many years ago called the adjusted graduation gap. The FGR focuses on retention and how many athletes enter a university and graduate 6 years later. Well, we know that there are limitations to that federal graduation rate because we have a high percentage of college athletes that transfer or drop out or leave school in good academic standing, as do everybody else who attends a college. The graduation success rate, however, what they do is they remove those athletes who transfer or leave in good academic standing from the cohort. So what you're left with is a success rate in which you're really measuring how many athletes out of your cohort started and then ended up being seniors and then graduating. So if you think about it, for example, back many years ago, John Calipari said famously in a press conference when he was at the University of Memphis, he said, "I graduate 85% of my seniors." Well, if you stop to think about it, what's next from being a senior is graduation. So you should graduate a high number of your seniors because they've made it to graduation. And so the graduation success rate, which you have to understand is the way the data is gathered and disseminated, you are going to have a high graduation success rate. There's a reason why the NCAA put success right in the name of the metric, because they knew it would be successful. They started doing analyses on the graduation success rate in the late 1980s, early 1990s, where they took all of the athletes that left the university either in their sample, either transferred or left in good academic standing. That was about a third of the cohort. And what they found was that the graduation rate that was a result of that was about 16 to 25% higher than the federal graduation rate. And all of this work was being done just as if you remember back when Dexter Manley and Kevin Ross were testifying before Congress, and Dexter Manley, who was an All-American football player at Oklahoma State, said that he was functionally illiterate when he graduated from Oklahoma State. So the graduation success rate and by proxy the APR are designed to return a success rate that's very high. The graduation success rate overall right now is about 92% for all college athletes. And if you're doing your job within an athletic department, you know that that's not that difficult to do, because all you have to do is if someone's going to leave, you make sure that he or she leaves in good academic standing. I actually have a student that got in touch with me and said he needed to find out what he needed to do to get a C in my class. And the reason he wanted to get a C in my class was he's getting ready to go overseas and take advantage of a professional opportunity. What he wanted to do was to make sure that it didn't affect his coaches or the athletic department's GSR or APR. And APR is a metric that keeps track in real time how athletes are making progress towards a degree. So what you have to understand is the FGR has some limitations. The GSR has limitations. The adjusted graduation gap, which we've developed and used, we take care of trying to deal with the part-time bias, because some colleges and universities have many more part-time students. If you have a high percentage of part-time students, you're going to have a lower graduation rate. So for example, Weber State University has 60% of the students at Weber State are part-time students. They have an FGR overall of the university of only 41%. Why? Because the majority of their students are taking longer than 6 years to graduate. So not everybody is created equal. Not every university is created equal. Clemson, on the other hand, has only 4% part-time students. They have a FGR graduation rate of 85%, much higher. So what you have to do and what we do with the adjusted graduation gap is we account for that part-time bias, and then we're comparing full-time student graduation rates to full-time athlete graduation rates in the sports. And that's what we look at. So what we find in basketball, for example, overall, the overall gap between full-time students and full-time men's basketball players in the major conferences is 33%. So athletes graduate at a rate that's 33 points lower than that of full-time students. And which fundamentally asks the question, we know the graduation rates are low for college athletes in football, Power 5 football, and men's basketball. And the reason is because those athletes are working a full-time job. It doesn't make sense for us to have athletes working a full-time job and going to school full-time. I would ask anybody to justify pedagogically or educationally why we ask college athletes to go to school full-time in all instances. So maybe I've bored everybody with the statistical or the graduation rate metrics, and I'll take some feedback from the panel.
One thing I want to throw in just real quick, as Dr. Southall was talking about GSR and maybe some of the how the numbers might be a little inflated. artificially. Another thing that exists to actually directly artificially inflate graduation numbers are the GSR, the grad bonus points for student athletes who return to college after leaving. I think there's positives on some ends. I think there's negatives, but just the way that particularly the way that it impacts the GSR, the graduation success rate. I've been on an academic staff for a specific revenue generating team where 1 year we had a we had an over 100% graduation success rate. So we graduated 111% of the people in this cohort. And so how is that possible? Well, because we had people return to the institution who left in 1985, 1995, whatever. They left the institution. They cost the department an APR point. Dr. Southall referenced APR. APR measures, are your student athletes eligible and are they retained? So you get 2 points, an eligibility and a retention point. And so for folks who left and would have lost a retention point, if you come back, when you finish your degree, your grad bonus point gets tacked on to that current cohort. So you might see a graduation rate that's 110%. It doesn't seem like it's possible, but so it's another kind of tricky aspect of the way that graduation rates are measured from the NCAA, and maybe part of the reason why, or that just highlights what Dr. Southall was saying about the NCAA wants to lean into this measure because it is so high and it's so favorable for athletic departments.
And I think too, I think Richard brings up and Howard bring up some great points in that if we're really thinking about reform, why is it that we are so married to this full-time enrollment aspect? If we are going to essentially be in the professional sports business, why not let the athlete do their education on their own time, so to speak, and what works with their schedule? You could still have a 5-year eligibility clock in college athletics, but why does that athlete have to be full-time when they're required to essentially work that full-time job? And why couldn't they come back, have a guaranteed post-eligibility scholarship to be able to fulfill their educational requirements if they want to do that? Some are fully capable of doing both, right? We've had numerous that have proven that. Craig Krenzel up at Ohio State was, I think, a molecular biology major, was able to pull that off. There's many that can do that. But if others say, look, this fall semester, I just want to focus on football, I've always said they should be allowed to do that. We should be more concerned, in my view, not by an artificial metrics that we've talked about, like APR, GSR, and 6-year graduation rates. We should just be concerned about that the athlete has a viable access to an education whenever that may be. And so I do think if we need to think outside the box here, and instead of what's wrong with having a part-time student or even a no-time student play college sports, knowing that they'll be able to access that educational opportunity at any time in their life.
Well, if I could interject a little bit, I think what this comes down to in many ways is a paternalistic view of college athletes, in which they are viewed as children that need to be protected and molded and guided, where in fact they are adults who have or should have agency and should have the right to be fully involved in their educational opportunities. Because from a specific to a Power 5 football player and a Power 5 men's basketball player, using that cohort as an example, who would be a really motivated student would be a player who's been cut from their 3rd NFL roster and is now looking to finish out a degree, and they can choose what they want to study. And I'm not denigrating interdisciplinary studies or any other general studies majors, but speaking back again to a specific coach at the University of Memphis, of the 85% of his seniors that graduated, of those that graduated, 21 out of the 22 that graduated in the same major, which was interdisciplinary studies, which again, that may be a perfectly legitimate reason or legitimate major, but is that what the athletes chose? Did we give those athletes agency to make their own educational choices?
And if there's just last thing, and if they are choosing that, like, why are they choosing it? Or are they prepared? Are they supported to make an informed decision, or a decision that's going to be fruitful for them or is that decision what's easiest for sport?
I think, Lisa, you were about to say something a little bit ago.
Yes, what Dave talked about, this idea that athletes don't need to be full-time and perhaps can be full-time athletes and then pursue their degree afterward, is one of my favorite proposed models in the Unwinding Madness book, What Went Wrong with College Sports and How to Fix It. That's Jerry Gurney, Andrew Zimbalist, and Donna Lopiano, probably not in that order, but it's a model I think makes a lot of sense, because if we consider like a semi-pro team that, you know, still is the Oregon State Beavers with the same colors and uses the same facilities. I often joke, when I was watching March Madness, I turned to my husband and asked him, do you care what the students' classes they're taking are right now as you watch them play a game? And he said, of course not. So I don't think anyone really needs to be concerned if, I don't think the general public even knows that athletes have to be enrolled in at least full-time status and any of these rules that we navigate. So I think that's an interesting model because it seems realistic, where it doesn't change anything. We still have the same age group playing the sport. They're still the Kansas State Wildcats. They're still in purple. And then afterwards, they have the time to focus on their meaningful education that they deserve in exchange for their athletic talent. And I'll have to echo, just because I saw Richard last week at College Sports Research Institute conference, and we had many conversations about this culture of babying. I think one of my biggest pet peeves is calling athletes kids. Most people don't say kids about other college students typically. And he had presented a study on the use of kids in football broadcasts. I noticed every 3 seconds in a basketball game, the announcer calling an athlete kid. I just say not a kid at the TV about 100 times in every game. And this is a grown man basketball kind of thing. And that's also silly. Those sort of things are permeating in this system as well. And it's difficult for athletes to, what I call, own their educational journey, because someone is making the decisions for them a lot of the time, just given how things are, and people don't like things to change because they have been the way they are. But things like NIL, 3 years ago, nobody was happy about it. Now it's just the norm. Transfer portal, I think people will not get all hot and bothered as the sky has not fallen with any of these other interventions or changes. And so we just need to be open to the fact that if the students want to participate as athletes only and then be students later, then it's not really going to be the biggest difference in terms of what we're seeing on a court or on a field.
I think that's really interesting. And I want to come back to this idea about agency and control, a thing that I have talked about a lot in these kinds of environments, is the idea of yes, coach. We say oftentimes the only answer to a coach response is yes, coach. And I think it's interesting at a school where I worked that brought in a general studies or interdisciplinary studies major, did so because in large part the athletic department wanted it. It wasn't something necessarily that academic folks wanted. And those coaches that I worked with were often the biggest proponents of including that major into our academic profile. And we have to ask ourselves why. But I think that's a thing that we might want to come back to. But for now, I want to get to the idea of the model, those two models, Richard, that you brought up, the education model and the commercial model. And I want to ask you all how those two models and the differences, the divergence between those two models bring themselves up when we talk about the idea of a promise of a meaningful education.
Well, I'll jump in. We've been using college sport broadcasts as a proxy for how invested or looking at the institutional field of college athletics for a number of years. And I would ask one simple question. How many times during the March Madness broadcast or a college football playoff game is there any mention of an athlete's major? Well, I know the numbers, and it's you can count them on one hand. So that's one thing. Clearly, the collegiate model is a hyper-commercialized model. When we're looking at the sports that we're talking about, which are Power 5 football and men's basketball, with women's basketball trending that way. So we're not talking about college sport writ large. And I think that's the first thing that you have to come to grips with, is that there are two distinct college sport models in play. And colleagues and I have come up with the term profit athletes versus loss athletes. And a profit athlete is an athlete whose market value is greater than their grant and aid. So if we use that as the delineation, we can see that those athletes are highly commercialized and their recruiting processes are different. We completed a study this past year where we looked at the itineraries for recruiting visits of a wide spectrum of sports, ranging from equestrian to swimming, gymnastics, and then football. And there are significantly fewer items related to academics in the sports of Power 5 football and men's basketball. So these athletes are being recruited not as students, they are being recruited as football and men's basketball players who their role is to come to the university and through their labor to support the educational and athletic opportunities of all the other athletes. And so until we come to grips with the fact that this system is hyper-commercialized and highly racialized, we really can't look at expecting that we're going to have meaningful reform.
You're on mute, David.
Sorry about that, as always. Hang on. Am I good now?
You're good.
Okay. Typically with Zoom, even in this culture after all these years from COVID. I think too, what we have to look at is and recognize we are the only country in the world that does this. We're the only country in the world that has a significant portion of its elite development model and development for many professional leagues for its national and Olympic teams embedded in the education system. That in itself, we've talked about it already, causes inherent conflict, and the incentives are for athletic success rather than academic success. And many times we toss these athletes away. And let's be honest, there are many times I saw it myself, athletes actually graduated and didn't even have the requisite skills of whatever major they graduated in, meaning I saw these athletes in their senior year not able to construct a complete sentence. That is a failure of the system, a failure of the institution. And we have to look at, as a country, is this really the way we want to go? If we want to continue to have elite sports development largely connected to our education system, then we have to look at the system within and talk about things like I thought Lisa eloquently talked about doing it different and just accepting it. You know, instead of saying, hey, you get this great education for playing a sport, which largely is untrue, and in many ways is a lie to protect the commercialization. Let's look at doing something different. We will still watch. I was asked by a reporter a couple of years ago, what would significantly have to change for people not to be interested in college sports? And I said, nothing will ever prevent people from being interested in college sports. Regardless of what happens, if I'm handing out wheelbarrows full of cash to people walking into Ohio Stadium at Ohio State just up the road from me, that stadium's going to be full when they're playing Michigan, regardless. We simply don't care. We will watch, and we need to recognize that, but also still keep the educational opportunity open and say you can get that in many different ways, in a myriad of different ways, but you don't have to be a full-time student over 5 years so we can perpetuate the facade that you're getting this world-class education while we're being entertained.
And just to echo a few things, I mean, for us to get closer to that promise of a meaningful education, the model is simply has to change, because even if we figure out graduation rates and everybody's graduating at the same rates, full-time students and full-time, Power 5 revenue producing student athletes, again, the question that Dr. Southall addressed early, like what is a meaningful education? Well, we all know that it's outside, it encompasses more than just a graduation. You know, like David just said, there are folks who graduate who can't read, who don't have the requisite skills to actually, get through a year of college, but somehow they graduate. So what about the other parts of college? A full, robust undergraduate education. What about the career relevant learning opportunities, internships, job shadows, mentorship programs, just different levels of engagement that we know yield positive, have positive impacts on student achievement, post-college outcomes, these are things that our elite athletes, our revenue generating student athletes, when they're working that full-time job of being an athlete, they just simply don't have time or bandwidth, or they don't have the time or the bandwidth to engage in a lot of these opportunities and develop competencies outside of their sport. But then there's also the aspect of like, they understand that they were brought here for sport, to produce revenue, to produce wins. And so like, there's a level of lack of utility value on their part, which is reinforced and they're beaten over the head with like, you're here as a student athlete. We're not going to miss practice for class, but we're going to miss class for practice or for the game. So that is just very clear. All these messages every day from recruiting through the whole thing is very clear. You're here as a commodity, as an asset. You're here with a specific specific duty, And so while that exists, there's the structural barriers of time and bandwidth to engaging in career relevant learning opportunities, and there's also the cognitive aspect that's a barrier as well. And so it's not just the graduation, but it's everything else around being a college student.
Lisa, do you want to add to that discussion about the education model versus the commercial model?
Sure. I'm thinking about how last year was the 50th anniversary of Title IX. I did a study with Nancy Lowe on the 40th anniversary of Title IX, and we considered that in the history of women's sports, there was an educational model. And then when the NCAA took over, the AIAW became part of the male model, which is a commercialized model. And so I don't see the educational model as it was defined, pre-Title IX, pre-1972, and how women's sports were extracurricular. There was no women's scholarships, no recruiting. Coaches were not paid because they're all women, of course. So those things, I think, make it evident to me historically that there's not an educational model in place, and there hasn't been since the NCAA started championships. But to what Howard said, I wanted to just share, my experience as an athletic advisor was to encourage students to pursue the degrees of their choice and to meet their educational goals. And, because of just that, I don't know, I was labeled an idealist by a director that I worked for. I was called into my dean's office when I was in this role because she said my expectations for my students were too high, because I was pushing them to enroll in 15 credits instead of 12 because that's what they wanted to do. And I've thought about this for years, but I wish I could have asked, well, are your expectations for coaches too high? Or the expectations coaches put on the students too high to win as much as possible or to be their best? Because why would that, their coaches being paid a lot more than me as an advisor, why would their expectations for athletics be okay, but not my expectations for students to earn their meaningful education and have access to what they want to study? So that has been bothering me for probably over a decade. And that is an example of why I think the priorities are not in the right place right now.
Yeah, Dave, I see you got your hand up, but I want to say this real quick. Lisa, I would say, idealist, man, I would take that in a heartbeat. I was called a lot worse for having very similar, ideals to yours. The discussions with coaches that I work with teams that I work with, got a little bit interesting, and I would take idealist any day. Dave.
Me too, Bruce. I've been called a lot worse, and I've also been called an idealist. But I just wanted to piggyback off of what Howard said, that I think it's important to talk about education encompasses so much beyond the classroom, and that we're so limiting with what we can do for the athletes. And I also want to bring up the fact, again, why the Drake Group even started is the faculty and the faculty's role, and the role that they've largely abdicated. I can tell you things that I've seen. I'm sure others on the panel can relate to it, but one thing that I do quite extensively, Howard, is study abroad. And I was on a study abroad program, and I did have a football player, which again, I was pleased that he was able to go. He was getting ear banged on the phone by his coach. Are you doing your workouts? Are you doing that? And this is a summer program that I actually interceded and said, Coach, that's it. One more call from you, and we're going to have a serious problem. It's my program. Okay. I'm not coming to your practice and asking all these things, asking if people are doing their studies. Okay, you're on my time. I said, do not call again. I had some upper administration intercede. Why'd you talk to a coach like that? We should be able to talk to a coach like that, right? We should be able to tell the coach to say, this is my classroom. I don't let class checkers come in my classroom or do anything like that, because it leads to the infantilization or babying, let me use the easier word, of this whole process. So as faculty, we also need to stand up, those of us that are faculty, and certainly even advisors, but certainly faculty can stand up to coaches, stand up to the system and say, look, no, this is an academic, if we're in the system, this is an academic program, and you're not going to be involved in it at all, period, or else I'm going to come and tell you how to run plays.
Dave, I really want to see you on the sidelines at Ohio State versus Michigan calling plays. That'd be great. I want to shift the conversation just a little bit and ask the panel this question. There are clear racial implications when talking about college sport and the promise of a meaningful education. What does your experience tell us about those implications?
Well, I'll jump in. Clearly, the commercial model is powered by the athletic labor of Black males. March Madness is one example. College football playoff is another example. And we need to recognize that all of college sport down through the Division II and Division III, they owe their championship, the income that supports their championships, to March Madness. So what you have to recognize is that the secret that nobody really wants to talk about is the fact that Power 5 college football is about 85% of the starters that have the high value in revenue production are African-American males. The same percentages are in Power 5 men's basketball, trending that way in women's basketball as well. So what we have to understand is that the 3%, Mark Emmert famously said in 2014 that the issues that we're talking about pertain to only 2 to 3% of all college athletes. Well, those 2 to 3% of college athletes are disproportionately African-American males. So what we have is a system that provides educational opportunities to a wide variety of college athletes at much higher rates than the African-American males in the Power 5 sports. And what we have to come to grips with is that those athletes, we are relying upon their athletic labor, and the education that is promised to them is being systematically denied, and it's disproportionately falling on African-American males.
And I think too, Bruce, and I'll to echo off that, and one of the questions that you wanted me to address from the beginning is what we call the original sin of college sports. I want to make it clear in the Drake Group, myself, and I think everybody on the panel, we think that anybody should be admitted to college if the school wants to admit them. But it is a crime. And the original sin, as my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Gerald Gurney, used to say, that we would admit somebody into an institution and not give them, help provide them the requisite skills so they can compete academically as a student. And that's where, again, a lot of the fraud and a lot of the issues happen. If we're bringing in somebody who is academically unprepared, and I'm saying the school should admit them if they want to do that, but if they are below, as one of the Drake Group's policy positions is, if they are below more than one standard deviation below the academic profile of the incoming freshman class, they should have intensive academic remediation. And yes, that means reduced athletic obligations and not being eligible for a year. I had a little argument with Seth Greenberg of ESPN, the former basketball coach of Virginia Tech and South Florida, saying that was cruel and unusual and not providing someone an opportunity. And I said, Coach, what do you do when somebody's not, athletically ready on your team? Maybe needs a little more seasoning and experience. It's like, oh, we redshirt them for a year. I'm like, oh, gee whiz, Coach. So we do that athletically, but yet you're protesting actually doing that academically. If we're going to bring somebody in, we owe it to them Okay, and it is a crime if we don't do it. To do what we can to remediate them, to bring them up academically so they can be successful. This is why we had issues like we had at North Carolina. This is why we see systemic academic fraud issues because these inherent pressures that we talked about earlier are piling on. So, institutions that should admit who they want, but we owe it to these young men and young women. I'm trying not to say kids, to these young men and young women to bring them up to academic standards so they can compete academically and athletically if we're going to keep the current system that we have.
I think there's room, David, to talk a lot about remediation, the original sin, and what maybe preceded the original sin is our American fascination with racializing academic admissions, collegiate admissions. There's room to talk about that as well. But I want to hear from Howard and Lisa as well about the racial implications of our inability to follow through on the promise of a meaningful education.
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I think, of course, there's racial implications, and following the David and Richard. If we look at the Power 5 institutions, the schools across the Power 5 institutions, we have 50%, give or take, of the student athletes and revenue generating teams are Black males. Dr. Southall just cited that 85% of the folks, really the labor, the money generators, the starters are Black males. Well, at these same institutions where all this money is being generated by Black male student athletes, there's about 2 to 3% of the populations are Black males. So we got 2 to 3% of all these schools, their undergraduate population is Black males. Yet when it comes to all the money, the millions and millions and millions of dollars and billions of dollars being generated, 85% of the folks generating that money are Black males. So when you look at that disproportionate representation, it just is very clear that the commodification is very clear. The value, where you find Black males on campus are the laborers, the ones who are going to earn the money. And that's also where we find the most difficulty and the most pressure and the most and the least likelihood to accrue the full benefits of an undergraduate education. Those numbers, they're just, those are just startling, but very clear. And when we see it with our own two eyes.
Thank you, Howard.
Just to add, so I've done some research on the type of student that has scholarship, what sport they're in, what the demographics are, time to degree, and academic performance. And while the majority of scholarship athletes graduate more timely than non-scholarship athletes, the ones who play men's basketball and football tend to take a lot longer in terms of number of semesters to graduate if they graduate. And that's typically Black males, because there's not a lot of Black females outside of specific sports at a number that we could consider viable for studying, like track and women's basketball primarily. So there's lower GPAs, longer time to degree if they finish. And it's primarily in those two sports, which again, as everyone has said, is overrepresented by Black males who are not representative on campus.
Thank you to the group. I think this is a really interesting part of the discussion. And I want to dig into the original sin piece a little bit more. And thank you, Dave, for bringing that up. From Drake's perspective, that original sin is allowing, as Dave said, allowing athletes with poor academic preparation into colleges and forcing them to compete in classrooms when they're not ready. And I would love to know from the rest of the group your thoughts about this original sin position. And also, if you could talk a little bit about how institutions might better manage the interplay between college athlete access and college athlete academic success, especially for those athletes who are less prepared for the rigors of academic competition.
Well, I think, Bruce, as I mentioned earlier, I really do like our Drake Group proposal, which you were part of helping put together. Again, admissions decisions should not be on the athletic department. But again, we also should not be a barrier to access to others who, through no fault, and I shouldn't say through no fault of their own, but largely sometimes from the communities and zip codes they grow up in. I myself had very poor academic preparation and needed intensive remediation my freshman year of college. And, a lot of that fell on my shoulders, but also too, just when we look at the educational, primary and secondary educational issues that we have in America, that of course is a discussion for another day. But I do think that admissions decisions have to be decisions of the faculty. But if you are going to make a decision to bring someone in, athlete or non-athlete, who has poor academic preparation and is more than one standard deviation below the academic profile of the incoming freshman class, that there has to be a detailed plan of remediation to get that young man or young woman up to an academic standard where they can compete. We would never put a college athlete in a position where they couldn't compete athletically. We would either get rid of them or we wouldn't recruit them. Why would we put somebody in a situation where they couldn't compete at least reasonably on an academic standard at the school that has recruited them? And to me, it's mind-boggling. And like I said, essentially criminal that we would bring somebody in and not do that and then we would then construct a system so that they were able to, at least the facade of being academically eligible, again, so we can keep that commercialized revenue and winning going. That to me is where, again, it comes down to the faculty should have control over that. And we should enforce. If you don't meet this standard, you will be remediated at this institution. And I'm sorry, $10 million a year coach, that's the way it's going to be.
Thanks, Dave. Others?
Yeah, I think David summed it up really well, or hit on a lot of my thoughts. The only other thing that I'm thinking about, because I'm gonna say echo everything David said. He's got the pathway figured out for a better landscape. But I just think about who else is being let in, or I guess I just think about like the commodification aspect, the fact that like the only place you're gonna find Black males on campus, not the only place, but we're talking 2% elsewhere. The only place you're gonna find Black males is where the money is being made. And so I do like the idea of intense remediation. It just makes me think about it still makes me think about commodification and how okay, we'll bring in these students who maybe are not prepared, who maybe are not going to be competitive in a college classroom, and we'll work with them. We'll give them all this support that they need to get up to speed or to be successful. But as long as they can provide some economic value to us, as long as that return on investment is clear to us, that's the only thing that's going to propel us, or the main thing that's going to propel us to work with vulnerable populations or more underserved, historically underserved groups or higher need groups, is if there is going to be an economic return on that investment in such a large, high profile way. I know we're talking about college sports, that's what we're all on here to talk about, but it just jumps out at me as man, it's just such an interesting relationship that universities have with Black students, Black males, and yeah, we'll take you as long as you can make us some money, and we'll work with you. And that's really the only circumstance.
I'll follow that. I started my career in college admissions, so I do find this very interesting. I also co-authored with Dave and Jerry Gurney and Sarah Stokowski an article about the original sin in terms of the history of special admissions. And all the varsity blues jokes aside, I think what this basically comes down to is competitive advantage. So an institution like Stanford or Berkeley will take athletes below their standards because they want to be competitive in their conference and with non-conference opponents. It's the same across the US. And so if anyone, now I can't believe this is 12 years old, but Jerry Gurney wrote an op-ed in Chronicle of Higher Ed called Stop Lowering the Bar for College Athletes in 2011. And it's basically the standards for the NCAA typically are lower for initial eligibility than any college admission standard. And so therefore, all of these institutions are going to lower their standards for the athletic talent and other talents. I'm not saying it's only athletes, but it's something that's now, it's the system. It's just how it is, and people accept that. But then to hire a couple learning specialists at $40,000 each we can't do that. We have to give the coach a $100,000 academic bonus for the work of the learning specialists that are already there at $40,000. So there's a lot of weird prioritization of, the coach needs incentives, even though they're already millionaires, but we can't provide support folks for the students that we're bringing in that aren't able to navigate how to read a college textbook or how to take notes in a class. And that's where the trouble comes in, because then athletic departments who don't have the resources to support the students are still trying to be competitive. I think it's very similar to cost of attendance. When all the Division I schools said, we're going to do cost of attendance, well, that meant, the group of five needed to match the Power Five if they wanted to recruit somebody is almost as good. And then it, trickled down the hockey team needs to do it, but for Title IX, we have to do it for the women's hockey team and all these things. It's always like a keeping up with the Joneses type of thing in athletics. We call it the arms race when there's new facilities and locker rooms. It's almost the same thing in terms of how can we get the best talent, get the most out of them, and then hopefully they graduate with something. And that starts with these low rules, these low bars that we have, and students being eligible to compete below college admission standards.
I think that's a really interesting part of the discussion. And you used the word incentive, Lisa, and I think that connects to something Howard said earlier as well about how to incentivize success. And what that makes me think about, and this might shift the conversation a little bit, is the schools, the departments, the programs that are getting this right. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about that. Are there examples of institutions or specific athletic programs that do this well, that provide athletes with access to a meaningful education, and as well as a high level of competition in terms of college sport? And what can we learn from the folks that get it right? Are there examples out there?
Could I interject something before we go to that?
Sure.
I apologize. I was trying to raise my hand and I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand on Zoom. I'm going to propose a possible solution to this issue, because fundamentally we're talking about a subset of college athletes that most all of these issues arise from. I'm not saying that there's not whatever's cheating or whatever you want to define it going on in other sports. But I would contend that if profit athletes are deemed to be employees by the National Labor Relations Board, and that is instituted on college and university campuses, I think many of the educational malfeasance taking place can be dealt with. Because if it's an educational benefit that I as an employee have a right to get, then I have the agency to control that this is the class that I want to take. It's my benefit. It's not yours. This is not a paternalistic system. This is a system in which we have collectively bargained working conditions. So I know it sounds radical, but what I think might actually work is having college athletes being given educational benefits, and it could be in the form of a voucher that they can redeem over a period of time for X number of hours. They don't have to be full-time students. So I think a radical restructuring of this, in which education is viewed as a employee benefit that is negotiated and is part of a negotiated collective bargaining agreement, would solve a good deal of these problems.
I think that's really interesting, Richard. And I think I agree with you that when we talk about the system, and we used the terms earlier, the athletic environment, the college sports environment, we talked about the models. When we talk about that systemic thing, the word radical comes to mind, right? Radical change is definitely necessary, system-wide. While I don't want to give that radical model that you're talking about with your short shrift, I do want to think about how we're seeing success now. Who's doing this right? What are they doing that's right? What when we talk about folks getting it right, what is the outcome in terms of meaningful education for those athletes that get to work with them? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer here.
But you're going to be though, aren't you?
Yeah, probably a little bit, because I have doubts that anyone's doing it really right because of the inherent pressures. Not that they don't want to. And I do think it comes down to the individuals. Sometimes it's going to be individuals standing up to coaches. It's going to be individual faculty members. So I think there are pockets of where there's probably some great cases of where it's being done. But I think to say, for me at least, I'd love to hear what others say, but to say like this department is getting it right, I have my doubts because it just would be difficult for me to think of when, again, like Lisa said, winning is the ultimate goal, revenue generation, competitive equity, doing all these things, that it matters, that competitive balance that, at least in my experience of working college athletics, the couple decades I spent in it, it was always at the end of the day, yeah, it's all great to have all these academic goals and priorities and all the other things, but in the end of the day, we got to keep the kid eligible. And eligibility maintenance is not access to meaningful education, in my view. And so I just think systematically it's impossible to do it right. Not saying that there aren't some great people out there, Howard and Lisa when she worked in the business and so many others that I know. This is not an insult to people individually, because I know some are really, really trying to do it the right way and caring about the athletes as individuals and their own educational progress and success. But overall, systematically, I just don't think anyone is doing it right.
I think one of the things that I was just thinking here brings to mind, the current model and people doing it right, et cetera, is like having a person who smokes 3 packs of cigarettes a day, but we really are doing a really good job with cancer treatments for that person's lung cancer. So I think, unfortunately, within the system, even if you are doing it right, the system is rigged against you, so to speak, and it's almost impossible to have a meaningful education, even if you're doing it what we would consider to be the right way.
Howard, go first. Okay, you're being quite kind.
Okay.
I'm going to combat Dave a little bit on this one because I have a book that I co-authored called Implementing Student Athlete Programming, a guide to supporting college athletes, and there's a chapter on model programs at all 3 divisions. So I'm not saying these are the only programs at all 3 divisions that are the best, but that had really good resources and access to programming that maybe other institutions in those divisions do not offer, and really invest funding, resources, and support into students. So Division 1 was University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and Division 2 was Westchester in Pennsylvania, and Division 3 was University of Wisconsin, Whitewater. And so I can talk more about specific examples of what they do, but I just wanted to throw that out there that I have seen some programs that I thought worthy of writing in the book to show as examples to my students and other students who study athlete development in the graduate level. So Howard, now I will pass the torch.
Yeah, well, all I wanted to say was I really agree with a lot of what Dave said, and I'm interested to hear, I work in I oversee our student athlete development unit here at Oregon State. And so Lisa, talking about Nebraska, like I do often reference them. I haven't done the research academically like you on them, but I do reference them as a group that has a lot of resources. And I do wonder, I guess I agree with Dave and a lot of what Richard said in terms of like the system is just, it feels to me impossible to be doing it right on like a large scale, like that to make it a priority that we ensure that all of our football and basketball student athletes, among everyone else, that we're prioritizing a meaningful education over eligibility. That feels really difficult for me. And so I am curious about, what the findings were about some of those schools that are doing it right. But I guess, so for me, I just want to just sum it up and say, it seems impossible that currently the way the system is set up, that there are big time programs and departments that like really prioritize a meaningful education on the same way that they prioritize APR and GSR. And so I feel like it takes good people like Lisa Rubin who are in the department who on a micro level are individual practitioners that prioritize these things, that work against the system, that work against the culture and say, yeah, I know it's easiest to go into this easy online degree or whatever, but like, let's think about later. Let's start doing things now to develop competencies and to set us up for our dream job and things like that. I think that happens on a micro level with actors and practitioners that prioritize this stuff themselves.
Well, I think too, the one thing that we haven't looked at, and I know that many of us have talked about this over the years, but just a simple thing that I could not get done at Ohio University, by the way, I didn't even have faculty support, but is the reporting line aspect. When you have academic advisors who are reporting to coaches or reporting to athletic administrators, you clearly have the priorities already set. At the very least, if you're reporting to and you work for it, even your salary is coming from the provost's office or another academic unit, you at least have that separation and the ability, perhaps, I think in some cases, I know some have done this, and I don't know how Nebraska is set up this way, but I do know that N4A has put it out as a best practice, as Lisa knows, that at the very least, your academic support unit for athletes should not be under the control and purview of the athletic department.
Yeah, Dave, as a former practitioner who's worked under both of those models, I can say that it's a lot different to report to the provost than it is to the athletic department. I am interested, however, Lisa, in hearing a little bit more about those schools that, according to your research, are doing a good job, and to use my term, getting it right.
Thank you. Well, I have to, admit the bias of starting my career in Nebraska. So that's how I have, a lot of access to information about how things worked, years after I left there. Because if you've heard of athletic department turnover, it is a rare place where people do not leave. There's no place like it, I guess. So everybody who oversees academics and student athlete development there, which they still call life skills, by the way, has been there for over 3 decades. And everyone I worked with in the early 2000s is there or came back. So it's a really unique place in terms of truly committed to student success. They have the most academic All-Americans in the nation and have for many, many years. And that to me shows a priority of, applying for awards for students. They have the post-eligibility opportunities program, which allows athletes to have scholarship to either pursue an internship, graduate school, or study abroad, because they couldn't do that when they were having eligibility. And that is a model that they invested that money first before any other institution to do that kind of thing. So those things stand out. They separated the life skills unit now from the academic unit. So there's even more resources and support for career development, leadership development, and all sorts of other hot topics in college athlete development right now. So that is, one of the many reasons I think Nebraska does it right. They also, when I was in charge of the academic awards banquet for athletics, they had a $40,000 budget, I think, in 2006, which sounded so nice. Now it's way more than that, and they make a very big show of the academic achievements of students. So that is why Nebraska, I think, is fantastic, and you can read more about it in the book at a library. I'm not making anyone buy it. I don't make much money off of it anyway. The second, Westchester actually they've done a research study on their programming, and they just significantly collaborate in Division II because they don't have a huge staff or budget, but significantly collaborate with campus in a way where athletes are accessing learning support and career development that all other students access, which really is how we think it should be, I think, in the perfect world. So that they just have a very nice model of how they've achieved that working together between faculty, staff, and athletics. And so I think that's a really good one. You can read their article about how they do that rather than my book, because we just looked at the model that they had, and I talked to their faculty athletic representative. And then the Wisconsin Whitewater, now things may have changed because Christina Navarro, who's now the Wisconsin Platteville athletic director, was there at the time. But she implemented a leadership academy for the athletes in the Division III program. She also started a study abroad program, and all of these high impact practices that we don't see typically at different divisions outside of Division I were made a priority while she was there. And I think that's something that other institutions can look at and say, we can do this with a limited budget if we work on collaboration across campus and prioritize students having access to opportunities outside of their sport if they don't have time to access study abroad through the regular campus or joining an organization and becoming a leader that way. So I think those are 3 examples of great programs. I don't say they're all perfect or they represent all divisions or resource levels, but I think those are some good ways to say, okay, some people are doing things that we can take note of, and these are not the only 3. So I think that's important to note.
Thank you, Lisa. A couple of things that jumped out at me from your response, as well as your description of those 3 institutions, and from my experience as well One is coaches. Coaches have to be, they like to use the term buy-in. They have to buy in as well in terms of the priorities, what's prioritized and what's not. I really like the idea about being sure that athletes are connected to the rest of the campus, right? From my time at one of my institutions, it was rare that we saw athletes cross the street that divided the athletic side of the campus from the academic side of the campus. And there was very little in the athletic department encouragement for athletes to do that. And that showed in their academic performance and their inability to access the promise of a meaningful education. I think those two things are really, really important. And schools that do that have a chance at getting it right. I want to talk also a little bit, bring this conversation back to the idea about control and agency. And I thought it was really interesting, Richard, when you brought that up at the start of the conversation. And I noted that one of the things that I talk about a lot is this how we in college athletics tend to say, yes, coach, a lot. Coach asks for something, yes, coach. Coach needs something, yes, coach. And what that does is it works to the detriment of college athletes' agency and freedom to choose. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. If each of you could talk a little bit about that and how that impacts athletes' ability to to access the promise of a meaningful education.
Well, I'll jump in and maybe talk a little bit. One of the concepts that I think is important for people to sort of wrap their brain around is, which is an interesting metaphor, I'm sorry about that, but is the notion of a total institution. Goffman talked about a total institution being a like-minded group of individuals are isolated and live out their lives in a set functional area. College sport is really a total institution on most college campuses, and specifically the Power Five sports of football and men's basketball are as much or more so totally isolated than any other athletic department functional area. This leads to a lack of agency on the part of athletes because they know they're tightly controlled. It manifests itself in the grade checker phenomenon, manifests itself in structural, the way buildings are constructed on campus. You were talking about the dividing line on a street. Well, most often you have the athletic department has different functional areas that are the buildings that are isolated from each other. So this notion of a total institution, which leads to the athletes being tightly controlled, social media activity. You remember back in the day when social media activities, it was not all college athletes that were controlled, but it was only certain athletes. Only certain athletes had to undergo financial literacy, and certain athletes that are their registration is done for them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things which we talk about being enabling activities, they're also about control.
Richard, your reference of Goffman is taking me back to my dissertation as well. I appreciate that. Others? Dave, I think you're on mute.
There we go. So I think the key is, you're right. It is all about control under the guise of that we're helping. If you listen to the congressional hearing yesterday, it was all about, we care about our athletes deeply. We want to protect them from exploitation. We want to protect them from, financial pressures and all these bad actors when, as adults, we're going to have these things. We can't live in a bubble and, somebody might make a bad NIL deal, but there's many that are making great NIL deals and other things like that. It's really just the guise of paternalism and benevolence when it's really all about controlling and protecting the asset so that winning competitive equity and revenue can still happen. So for me, it took me a while to understand that, but just when I hear stuff like that, it's very tough for me to hold down my lunch, because I know bottom line is I don't doubt that they care, but I think in using what Taylor Brandt said several years ago, if you really care, then give them the rights that everyone else has, and certainly give them the right fundamentally to a real social mobility in their life, access to a meaningful education. And we're not even doing that, but that still is the go-to excuse, I should say, or the go-to reason why we have to somehow try to preserve this model that I would argue has never really worked.
Howard, Lisa, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just want to say also part of the control is like in the paternalistic aspect. We call them kids. We have to protect them and save them from themselves and the big bad stuff that happens in society. And also, you know, they're not ready to handle this stuff on their own or to exercise agency. They're also definitely not ready to share in some of the profits. You know, that would be crazy because then, you know, X, Y, and Z would happen. That's so bad and scary. So part of us controlling and this paternalistic perspective, you know, is obviously I'm being facetious here, but is you know, related to controlling the money too, you know, and to preserve that amateurism idea because like they need us for that. And, you know, so luckily, I guess we get to keep some of the money that they're not ready to have.
Lisa, if you're going to jump in, I will cede, but what I found interesting is the use of language. And I asked my class this the other day. I said, when you were a child, did you receive a negotiated salary or did you receive an allowance? And I think that's part of this infantilization, because if they're kids, we need to protect them, and we give them a stipend, or we give them an opportunity to have NIL. We don't negotiate with children. Children do what we say. So it's yes, coach. It's also going the other way and telling no, child, you can't do this.
I think that's really, really important, Richard. And we're getting close to the bottom of the hour. I do want to throw out one more question that comes through as a theme in some of the questions in the chat. And Dave, maybe I'll direct this to you. How do we bridge the divide between faculty and coaches?
Well, I think the big thing, and going back to what James Duderstadt, the former president of Michigan, said, and I did notice one of the questions in the chat, and it is very real. Faculty are reluctant to stand up because it can be very damaging when you look at people like Linda Benzel-Myers and others over the years that the Drake Group has honored through our Robert Maynard Hutchins Award as people who stood up to the athletic machine. But at the end of the day, faculty, not all faculty, but a good majority, a good selection of faculty have tenure and they have academic freedom. And with that, as Duderstadt said, is an immense amount of power and protection. I do agree that if, you know, faculty were unionized, that does perhaps give some other backing to it. But I also understand that even with that protection, that when you stand up, you are going to get ridiculed on social media. Believe me, I've had that happen. You're going to get ridiculed in the press and those types of things. But it comes down to leadership ethics and what is the right thing, right? If this is an institution of higher learning, right, and if we are not delivering on the promise of a meaningful education, then it is incumbent on the faculty to stand up for it. And I would say that we have to, as faculty, candidly, get a backbone. There's very few of us out there that are willing to stand up to the athletic department. I've worked in the SEC. It's not an easy thing to do, but it needs to happen. And faculty as a group collectively can certainly do that. Because I can tell you this, they're not going to fire a bunch of tenured faculty. You still have some power to push back, and we should do that.
Thanks, Dave. Others? It's a tricky topic, and oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Howard.
No, I just wanted to say, I think, you know, I think part of a challenge too is that athletics kind of has the cover of the stance or the perspective of like, you all don't understand what's going on in our world. We have a very unique student population. There's unique time demands. There's just, everything is just so unique over here. So like at Oregon State, it's south of the tracks, right? So we could say everything south of the tracks, like what we do is just so specialized that like these critiques from faculty members and PhDs and folks who have quote unquote never lived in this world, it's like we can disregard that critique because they don't know how to be successful or what it actually takes, you know. And so there's a great need for more collaboration, for more infusion of scholarship into practice in terms of how we support student athletes and what just the administration of, you know, support and resources looks like. But I just think I look at it as like two sides where like the faculty may have a critique, but then athletics is going to say, we're going to invalidate that critique because you don't know what you're talking about.
Mhm.
So it's just like, you know, this natural butting of heads that leaves it stagnant, like no progress, you know. And I think athletics is always going to say, you all don't understand until the practitioners, or until there's more infusion.
Mhm.
The scary part for them, Howard, is that there are some of us that do absolutely understand. And that's
Most
what's
of us
really
do
scary.
understand, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's an opportunity to create another narrative, right? I
Yeah,
think
and that's-
athletic departments, like Howard said, and folks who support them have created a narrative that says that other folks don't understand and won't get it right. And we do care, and we care more than you. And there's a chance to create a narrative that says something different. We've got only a couple minutes left, and I want to offer each of the panelists a chance, maybe 30 seconds for closing remarks.
Well, I want to thank Bruce and everybody else on the panel and everyone in the audience who asked such great questions. And like Rebecca said, we'll try to respond to those after if we didn't get to them today. I just feel like I think everybody here cares about student success, and for the access to education to lead to graduating with a degree of their choice that sets someone up for a future beyond just sports. It's okay if someone wants to pursue a professional athletic career, and if they're good enough or they can be the Olympian. I support it as someone who sees talents like that, but I also know that there's so much more to a student who also is a great athlete than just their athletic ability. And that's something that they have a hard time seeing when they're being told that your athletic talent is the priority. So I think we have a long way to go, but we're on it, on this journey together.
Yeah, Lisa, I think those are great comments. And I just want to say, and I think I've said it already, but I just want to echo that we do need radical change, and we can do radical change, and the enterprise is still going to survive. We're still going to watch the games. And if somebody wants to be a professional athlete over academic primacy at a certain time in their life, that's fine. If they want to come back and get their degree later, we should provide those avenues. We just need to think beyond this box and realize that the current model that we have is not working. Let's do something different. We're still going to show up and watch the games.
I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to spend time and visit about these issues. The faculty members who might want to engage with their athletic department, I would say two things. Number one, have sound theoretical frameworks that you're arguing from. And the second thing is take the data to them. Because one thing that coaches do understand is they understand statistics. They understand data analysis. So if instead of simply criticizing, I think it's much more important to critique and come up with a solution, whether it's a radical solution or not. Sometimes radical is what we need.
Yeah, and I just want to say, just to stay there, you know, let's keep dreaming up these radical solutions. Let's keep talking about them. Let's keep fleshing them out. And then, like Richard just said, you know, folks, they don't want to hear just a straight critique, you know. So, and a lot of times you got to find a way to make the information digestible. You know, don't come as an outsider, come as somebody who wants to help see change, you know. And well, let's keep dreaming. Let's keep having this ideal lens that we want to, places that we want to get to, because eventually, you know, I think we can get there, but we got to figure out ways to make the people listen, the stakeholders, you know, the people who are holding on and hoarding the power and clinging on to the old system. We got to really break down walls and barriers and find ways to allow these folks to listen, because their natural disposition is going to be, I don't want to hear that. You're bringing something scary. Get out of here with that. So let's keep having the convo. And, you know, I really appreciate Drake Group and everybody involved for bringing this as a discussion point.
Well, thank you, panelists, Dave, Lisa, Howard, Richard. I really do appreciate your participation today. Thank you to all the webinar listeners and watchers out there. We also appreciate you and the questions that you posed to the panel. I want to thank the Drake Group and the Drake Education Fund for the support. I also want to encourage everyone to find more information about the upcoming Alan Sachs Symposium, second annual, to be held April 18th in DC. Look forward to seeing you there. Thanks, everyone, and be well.